Hello and welcome to the 2021 Ohioana Book Festival. My name is Sherry Montgomery and I'm with the Licking County Library. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Ohio Tales and Trails and to welcome our authors Lynn Ford, David Giffels, and Betty Weibel. Lynn Ford was the first storyteller in the state of Ohio to be nominated for a Governor's Award for the Arts. She's a regular performer at regional and national storytelling festivals and conferences, including the National Storytelling Festival. Her featured book festival title is Supporting Diversity with Inclusion with Story. David Giffels has written 6 books of nonfiction, most recently, Barnstorming Ohio, To Understand America. His other titles include the memoir, Furnishing Eternity, A Father, a Son, a Coffin, and a Measure of Life, and an Ohioana Book Award winner. Betty Weibel is the author of the Ohio Literary Tale, A Guide, which will be released in May by the History Press Arcadia. She volunteers her time as a board member for both the Ohioana Library Association and Ohio History Connection, which inspired her to develop a digital Ohio literary trail. Moderating the panel is Ohioana's Executive Director, David Weaver. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherry. And thank you, Licking County Library. Thank my old friend, Kent Daniels, for hosting us and making it possible for us to do this exciting panel with 3 great favorites of the Ohioana Book Festival. They've been to the festival multiple times, and we're delighted to welcome them back once again. I'm going to do a little roundtable and everything at first, and I'm going to ask each of them the same opening question. And so I'll start with Lynn. Lynn, your book, Supporting Diversity and Inclusion with Story, which you have edited with your longtime friend and colleague, Sherry Norfolk. Yes, right there it is. Tell us how this book came to be. We know you're a wonderful storyteller, but now you've taken this story, as well as with your last book, Speak Peace, into a different direction. So share with us how this book came to be.
For me, it's a matter of respect for the spoken word, which was the way stories were carried for centuries before the printed format. But there are parts of the world where people don't necessarily hear the stories from their own cultures. When I was a preschool teacher, I told a tale of Anansi the spider that came to me from my auntie, who was born in the West Indies. And I was amazed that a little boy whose family had come from West Africa didn't know who Anansi the spider was. And his introduction to the tales from his own culture were his preschool teacher sharing from her family's cultures. And when he went home and told his grandfather what I had told, next thing I knew, his grandfather was coming in at story time to hear the stories. Sherry and I are great friends, and we talk about these kinds of things, and we wanted to give educators, storytellers, and other mentors an opportunity to share stories with young people that originated in the cultures of those young people. And the stories were gathered from people of those cultures and ethnicities, so that the roots of the story were as close to the roots of those who might enjoy them as possible.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And of course, speaking of diversity and inclusion, I know that David Giffels, you were certainly seeking as many diverse voices as you could. When it was just about 2 years ago at this time that you actually started on this book, was it not? And tell us how Barnstorming Ohio, how long had this idea been rolling around in your head?
It actually wasn't rolling around in my head. When after my previous book, Furnishing Eternity, was published, the New York Times book review, the reviewer referred to me as, quote, the Bard of Akron, which is a title that I maybe cringe a little bit, not because I'm not proud of having written so much about Ohio and my hometown and this region, but it made me think maybe I'm getting pigeonholed a little bit. And so I was talking to my agent about what we were going to do next, and And I had this completely different project that that was different, and it didn't get off the ground. And so this conversation took place right after the midterm elections in 2018. And he said, it just seems, and he's a lifelong New Yorker, he said, it just seems like Ohio just keeps coming up in these conversations about this strange direction the country's going in, and always in presidential election seasons. And he said, why don't you write an Ohio book that's about these times and in part about the upcoming 2020 election, but not directly about that. And so this process that started out with me trying to sort of step outside the boundaries of Ohio ends up with a book where the word Ohio is the largest word on the cover of the book. And so, yeah, so then I became, as soon as he suggested it, it just kind of popped into my head that we do have so much to tell about the present and direction of the nation. And we always have, and I've always believed that. And it seemed like a really important time to tell that story from within. And so that was kind of the mission I set out on.
And I'm glad you did. It was a fascinating book, and I was glad we got a chance to talk to it more in depth last November, right after the election, which certainly was a surprise to many people. So, but Ohio always has a way of being a surprising state. Just when you think you pigeonholed it, you haven't and stuff. So
yes, we are the weather.
Well, and moving on, Betty, I mean, I guess I don't have to ask if the word Ohio is in the title of your book or if it's the largest word, because it's certainly right there. And yes, hot off the presses, as we say, indeed, the Ohio Literary Trail, which we're excited about because it actually has emanated from a wonderful project which you, Betty, had the largest role in. It's the Ohio Literary Trail, a guide, and you have been the guiding force in both the trail and now the book. So if you could share, because I mean, this certainly has a longer genesis than just the past year when we began working on this.
The original Ohio Literary Trail was a map similar to the old-fashioned road maps, and it was much smaller than what exists today. And when I became a new member of the Ohioana board, I knew that they wanted to help the rest of the world understand Ohio's place in literary heritage and the incredible depth that the state has and increased awareness. And David and I were talking about that. And I had the idea to expand upon that original map and create a digital literary trail. And that lives on the Ohioana website. And I got that off the ground, and a lot of research and looking at all the authors are no longer living, and they're all from Ohio at one point or another. So I started exploring that, and it's been about a year since the book idea took off. It was the beginning of the pandemic, and like you guys, I'm a former newspaper reporter, but I get bored, and writing is how I keep it going. And so it combined a lot of my travel writing history, and my books have all been about horses, and there is not one horse in this literary trail. It's so sad. But there are more than 70 different sites around the state divided by regions. And like Lynn, we work together with Ohioana and the Ohio History Connection to help recognize writers, illustrators, poets, everyone from an incredibly diverse mix from the literary world. And they are exhibited through literary landmarks that people drive by every day and never stop to read or never notice in their own backyard. And that's what it also includes: museums, historical homes. And as we built the trail, we wanted to really make it show the diversity and the depth of the state and how Ohio has influenced the culture and literary landscape worldwide. And this trail is, as David said, something that we've had fun putting together. As I did the map, it was just a natural to expound on it in a book form and more of a travel guide. And so that's exactly what it is. The actual marker texts are in the book. the locations, the GPS locations. And we are encouraging people to get out in their own backyard and explore the treasures that are in Ohio.
Yes, indeed, because as we were saying, we were thrilled with the response, weren't we, Betty, to the Ohio Literary Trail when we first announced it. And it just seemed because we were right in the middle of the time of COVID, one of the worst times of COVID, and people were really stuck at home, but it was like they were already starting to think where I want to go once I get an opportunity to hit the road again. So, and one of the great things about the Ohio Literary Trail, it's divided into 5 regions, excuse me, 5 regions, north, south, east, west, and central Ohio. And that brings me back to Lynn, because one of those regions, southeast Ohio, covers a good bit of the territory that you are most familiar with, and that we first met each other because we booked Affrilachian Tales, which I wonder, can you explain for people what is an Affrilachian tale?
It's African-American Appalachian. And most people who have that heritage also include some European American, some Native American. The term was created by Frank X. Walker, a poet, fellow Affrilachian, and the first poet laureate for the state of Kentucky. He found that the dictionary stated that an Appalachian was a white person from that region of Appalachia, and left everybody else out. And Frank created the word. For me, that includes a combination, as I trace stories and heritage, a combination of West African, some West Indian, Cherokee and Choctaw, Scots, Irish, German, French, and English. And those are the people that I know about. So it's easier to say Affrilachian and get that heritage in there in one word.
Well, it's wonderful. And I know, like, for example, you know, a lot of people don't particularly think of the African-American community as being a part of Appalachia. But for example, just to name one example, very well known, our good friend Jacqueline Woodson, who will also be part of the Ohioana Book Festival, born in Columbus, but a lot of her family lives in Nelsonville and around Nelsonville. So very, very heavily imbued into that area. So it was a great thrill for me to find out about those Affrilachian Trails. And then of course, later on you came with Boo Tickled Tales as well. And I forgot, that was kind of like scary stories, was it not?
That was my friend Sherry and I challenging one another to take the stories we used to tell as preschool teachers and working with pre-K through grade 2. And little ones will say they want a scary story. They don't really want a scary story. And so we would tell tales that were kind of funny, unexpected, and we dared one another to put all the stories together. And I think we got the book completed in about 3 weeks because we already had the material. But these are for ages 4 through 9, and they're not really scary.
Well, talking about, you know, regions of Ohio and the fact that, you know, 5 regions of Ohio really, and I think, David, for Barnstorming Ohio, you actually did go into all 5 of those regions. And as you pointed out, you know, there is not just one thing as one Ohio voice. There are really 5 or maybe multiple voices.
Yeah, the plan was based in part on this concept, the 5 Ohios that political scientists and journalists have used to explain this phenomenon that only exists in this state, which is that we have 5 different regions that each have distinctly different voting patterns, distinctly different sort of cultural personalities that each reflects a larger region of the country. And so taken in aggregate, it's not just that this is the portrait of Ohio politically, socially, culturally, but rather this is the portrait of a state that tells a much wider national tale. And so these 5 regions are the Northeast, which is more racially diverse, more urban, more like the Northeast of the United States. The Northwest, which is much more like the true American Midwest, more agricultural, more conservative, more white. Southeast Northeast Ohio, Appalachia, which Lynn knows so well, a very different kind of culture, poorer, rural, struggling with different kinds of struggles than the other struggles around the state. Southwest Ohio, which is dominated by Cincinnati and feels much more like the American South. And then Central Ohio, which I call sort of the giant suburb of Ohio. Columbus is the only growing big city in Ohio, where the others have been fighting loss of population. And I also sometimes call it the Phoenix of Ohio. It's this more, different kind of culture there. And so I didn't want to just go to those regions. My true intention, which doesn't happen often enough, not just here, but in most places, is that we are, especially when we have something to offer, which in this case is electoral votes, we're often like beset upon by people who want to sort of do a quick study and unlock our secret and then move on. And so our narrative gets told from the outside. And I wanted to tell this narrative from the inside. I wanted individual voices to speak for themselves. I didn't want them to feel like they needed to represent a type or a poll number or a voting pattern or anything. I just wanted, for once, to allow the anonymous, the unheard, the invisible people, which again, I think is most of us. Tim Ryan refers during his campaign, to us, to flyover country, that's who he was speaking for. And so I wanted, to give voice to those people and in a large collection of them. So I interviewed more than 100 people for the book, traveled more than 4,000 miles over the course of a year, and really tried to get as many different voices in the book as I could.
No, fantastic. It's so wonderful. I do think you did a great job capturing all of those many different voices. And so anyway, now on to, so as we talk about, traveling over the state of Ohio brings us naturally back to Betty and traveling to visit literary sites. And one of the great things I think, Betty, and you encouraged us to do this, is that we didn't simply want people to think of the literary trail as visiting sites of all dead people, but we insisted on putting in events like the Ohioana Book Festival and Books by the Bank and the Buckeye Book Fair, where people can meet the authors from Ohio who are working today and who 25 years from now might be on the next literary trail.
You're right, David. It was really important. I took David Giffels' lead in using the regions of the state to get people out of their backyard and explore within our own state's regions. But I think you're absolutely right. It's a factor of having so much within our state and the ability to do that. And regardless of where you were, if you're in Northeast Ohio and you've got Toni Morrison, who we are going to be doing a literary marker for her later this summer, because there doesn't have one. There were a lot of names the average person wouldn't know in the literary world. We wanted to reach the average person. And so we peppered it with, in Northwest Ohio, we've got Mildred Wirt Benson, who is the original Carolyn Keene, who penned the Nancy Drew, first 23 Nancy Drew novels. And that's what got David and I really excited and started on all of this. Down in the Southeast region, I didn't use an author. I used an inspiration of Grandma Emma Gatewood, who is the Grandma Gatewood inspired many authors to write about her hike of the Appalachian 2,000-mile Appalachian Trail, and encouraged them to visit a section of that in Hocking Hills so that they would see the inspiration. And we wanted to attract outdoors enthusiasts who might not normally think of themselves in the literary world. So we did try to get a little bit of everything throughout the state and capture the diversity of Ohio's, not just history, and connect those importantly to the writers of today. And in each of the regions, we list one of the literary festivals that exists. Ohioana, the one we're obviously in right now in central Ohio. And we wanted, in the back of the book, I listed all the Ohioana award winners from the very beginning of time. And I listed Ohio authors and by genre and that were listed on that original map in the back of the book. Again, very important, like you said, David, to connect the past with the present and spark people's discovery of writers then and now.
And yes, I'm always very excited to tell people that speaking of Toni Morrison, who's probably the most celebrated Ohio author of the past 50 years and won the Nobel Prize in Literature, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Pulitzer Prize. The very, very first award she ever won was the Ohioana Book Award for Sula. And if you go on the Toni Morrison Society in their chronology of her career, it's really exciting to see us listed there as her first award. So, which of course, at that time when she was writing, she was still primarily known as an editor for Random House and just really at the early stages of her career. So very exciting to see the part that we kind of played in that storied career. And so it's wonderful. And, you know, talking about Toni Morrison, talking about, you know, the wonderful authors who have come from Ohio. And I know, for example, you know, in your new book, Lynn, you and Sherry are actually talking about a lot of different storytellers. Are a lot of them from Ohioans, or are they from all over the country?
Our tellers are from all over the country. I, of course, am the teller author for Affrilachia tales in the book. And I also did some of the discussion statements for other storytellers and revised their work for them. Because as I said, it's very much spoken word. But some of them have roots in other places, parts of Asia, South America, Central America, Europe. We tried to cover all the continents, and it was very, very difficult to get spoken word artists to be willing to put something in print. The only place we didn't cover was Antarctica.
Wow. Well, not surprising. I don't know who's down in Antarctica and everything. So, but
nobody.
I certainly appreciate your effort because, you know, again, to throw in a personal note, being my wife and daughter are Chinese, and now as we're seeing, you know, more problems, you know, that Asian Americans are facing, you know, and I think, you know, again, these stories that humanize people. I mean, people are getting too demonized at times, you know, just by where they're from, etc. So, and how stories can help to dispel those images.
Exactly. When you hear someone else's story, even if you never knew them before, somehow you feel acquainted. And that's because those stories have basic motifs and basic concepts to which all two-leggeds can relate. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do is share our stories with one another. I spent most of my childhood in the southeastern region of the state of Ohio, and it amazes me that people don't know that, and some people don't know that that's part of Appalachia. It just blows my mind. How could you not know that? And then I realized that's home for me, yes. From the western part of Pennsylvania down into there. So people don't know the story. They know the stereotypes, and they know, as David said, someone else telling the story, but there's a whole different connection when you meet people from that area, even if you meet them through folk tales.
Yes, yes, indeed. And of course, David, you've mentioned about the fact, you know, your chagrin about, you know, being called the Bard of Akron. And the thing is, like, you know, people have an impression that, you know, that whole part of Northeast Ohio, Akron, Youngstown, etc., you know, are falling apart. But actually, there is a lot of things going on. There are many exciting developments there, and you have written about them and stuff. I mean, of course, there's a lot, you know, that's negative as well.
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, I just wanted to comment. Lynn put it so beautifully about that power of narrative to remind us of our humanity, which is something, you know, it seems like a simple truth, but it was really deepened for me traveling around and just talking with people, is how much more alike we are than different. And, you know, one of the main tensions of this book is this era of division that we're in, and trying to get past that. But so I'm sorry, David, I lost track of your question. So you wanted me to...
I was talking about the fact, you know, that the impressions that people have, not just of ethnic groups, etc., Chinese, Black, whatever, but also of areas of, you know, if you tell somebody I'm from Warren, Ohio, oh gosh, I feel bad for you.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I have, because I wrote another book that has Rust Belt in the subtitle, The Hard Way on Purpose, Essays and Dispatches from the Rust Belt. I've had this debate with a lot of people about whether we should refer to ourselves as the Rust Belt, because it has such a negative connotation, but it's also a way to begin to contextualize where and how we live and our history. And I'm somebody who still embraces the term, because I think it's a way of embracing your hard times. It's our blues. And if you own your hardships and you understand your hardships, you have something to teach by telling your story. But I also recognize that, you know, that it becomes very easy for people to only know one example. So, you know, there's a debate too, for instance, about Hillbilly Elegy, because that book was so high profile and people associated it with Ohio, there becomes this assumption that all of Ohio is like that. And I see value in that book as long as that's one of many narratives being put out there about the life we're living. So yeah, so the Rust Belt region that I've written about and that I wrote about in this book as well is, it's a very important story to understand for its complexity. It's not a simple matter of having fallen. It's what it looks like when a region continues, perseveres, and what it feels like to go one step forward, two steps back, two steps forward, one step back, in a constant grind. You know, people used to, like, sometimes get asked, you know, is Ohio back? You know, is the Rust Belt back on its feet or whatever? And it's not really a relevant question. The relevant question, or the relevant answer, is that we just keep pushing ahead without worrying about, you know, the hardships and whether they've fallen. You know, when I wrote The Hard Way on Purpose, it was in that little spell where there were a whole bunch of Detroit books, and Detroit was being looked at as sort of like America's first great fallen city. And people were talking about that Detroit was dying. And here we are, you know, almost a decade later, and Detroit obviously didn't die. So we're just a young country. And so what does it look like when one of our cities undergoes its great fall and then continues? You know, that's a much more interesting story than the simplicity of a city that stumbled and fell and was finished. And you know, cities throughout history have burned and they remain cities. So that's the story I really like to tell, and that's why, you know, despite my not entirely certain desire not to write about Ohio again, I just find new stories to tell. One thing that this book taught me was how much more there is for this place to tell. It's such a rich, really infinite source of fascination and little stories and big stories.
Yes. Well, I'm talking about one of those stories, and actually has Rust in the title. Rust, a memoir of steel and grit by our good friend and somebody that Ohioan is very proud of, because just 5 years ago, she won the Ohioan Walter Rumsey Marvin Grant Award, and that was Elise Collette Goldbach, who was actually one of your students in the NEU MFA program up there, and has told a fascinating story, again, you know, based, you know, again in that, and rust is in the title, you know, from her experiences as a steel worker, which you never think of women as being steel workers. And she has fascinated this book that got such tremendous acclaim, you know, for a debut work of nonfiction. So I know we're all proud of her. And she will be at the book festival too. We're really excited about that. Hey, Betty, talking about the Rust Belt, I mean, one of the things that you and I talked about is how Northeast Ohio has, besides Toni Morrison, some of the most fascinating places on the literary trail, and some of the most fascinating authors, including Louis Bromfield and Malabar Farm.
You know, I couldn't pick one region of the state that, you know, that I had to pick as a favorite. But you're right, David. Northeast Ohio has some incredible history here with Malabar Farm, and I use the same regions that David did, slightly altered, and my Richland County ends up in Northeast Ohio by the tourism map. We also have the home of Superman. We have, you know, a lot of our sites are libraries, which are phenomenal tourism destinations for their art and for their stories. And the lovely tribute to Harvey Pekar is at the Cleveland Heights Library. So we've got incredible variety. Helen Steiner Rice out of Lorraine, who penned greeting cards, is an art. So we've got amazing variety here, as we do throughout the entire state. And as David said, what tends to happen is people, and I think Lynn said it, people tend to stay in their own area. And the pandemic hopefully will push them outside. You're stuck in Ohio, you're starting to get out. So maybe you'll drive a little bit farther outside of Northeast Ohio to Central Ohio. And you wouldn't think that we have that problem in our state, but we do tend to stay with what we know. And you could make a wonderful, people want to go to national parks and Europe. You could make a great trip to go to Southwest Ohio. I could spend days there studying Harriet Beecher Stowe House and Ripley House and you know, Paul Laurence Dunbar when they reopened. So within our state, we have opportunity and we have challenge, but we also have great tourism opportunities that won't take us far right now when we need to stay close to home too.
And one of the great things about Ohio, people forget, I mean, it's actually a pretty, I mean, it's really almost like shaped like a box, and there's no place that's really extremely far away. I mean, you go from Cleveland to Cincinnati, it's what, 4 hours? I know when I lived in California, I mean, LA to San Francisco was 8 hours. It was like driving from Columbus to St. Louis. So, yeah. But without leaving the state. So
you're right. And I think we've said Ohio's within, within 50% of the population is within a day's drive plus, and it's very convenient to get to. And within our own state, you can go corner to corner in a matter of hours, or you can just choose to take a quick drive down the road to get out of the house and see something you maybe never stopped to look at. And while you look at that destination, you know, the towns around them, the pride of the communities are so important. Mount Gilead, where Dawn Powell was born, that marker is the community pride to them. She's the most famous person. And as you look around the town and you discover so much of what Ohio has to offer, you're right.
Excellent. And you mentioned, of course, about libraries. Libraries are such an important part in all of these things. I know, David, you've been a guest for the Geauga County Public Library has one of the great speaker series of any, and again, it's a public library, and you hear people like yourself and Thridi Umbergar and wonderful people, Dave Pilkey, all the time. You'll hear fantastic people. We're thrilled to be hosted by the Licking County Library today. So it's wonderful, the libraries and the role that they play in fostering the literary community in the state of Ohio. Lynn, I know you've done a lot of things, you do a lot of your storytelling in schools and libraries and things. So, but you go far afield from the state of Ohio, do you not? I mean, I see your storytelling conventions all over.
Oh, yes, all over the United States. And I've been to Australia to tell stories, and I've been to Ireland twice to tell stories. And now, thanks to the Zoomiverse, I have told stories in India and Germany and some other places. But yeah, I'm not complaining about being connected through Zoom, because it has not only opened doors for me, it has opened up the world to hearing other voices in storytelling and printed format.
Yes, and of course, I know that we thought that was one of the first things last year, you know, when COVID hit and had an impact, that our first thought was, okay, we're going to postpone the 2020 book festival from April to August, thinking, okay, things should be better by then, not knowing how long this was going to stay, you know. And one of the positive things that's come out of it has been how people have learned. I mean, 10 years ago, there was no Zoom. So we would have just had to have canceled the Ohioana Book Festival. We were able to have it as a virtual event. We're doing it virtually again. So it is very fortunate that these technologies exist. And so I know we're all excited to get back together in person, but a lot of people are saying, I hope you'll keep, you know, find some way to keep the virtual part involved, because I mean, we found last month when we did our poster reveal for the book festival with a Tom Baddock, we had people online from Oregon, New Jersey, Florida. Now, obviously, at a physical event, those people would not be able to be there unless they physically traveled there to see it. So that is the one positive thing that has come out of this. Although I know it's been a difficult time, and David, going back, you actually, your last event, your book takes us right up to COVID-19, does it not?
Yeah, a book that was designed for me to travel the state for a year ends basically the day that everything shut down. I couldn't have timed that year either better or worse, depending on how you look at it. But yeah, I mean, the whole premise of the book required me to be engaged with people on the ground, and so it was. It ends in March 2019. It's a year ago, and it seems like 5 years ago.
Yes. I think it will be like, and of course, at that time, Betty, we were all working on the creation of the Ohio Literary Trail. And so the thought was, gosh, do we go ahead and do this? But we did. We launched it in the summer in the Ohioana Quarterly, as well as online. So, and like I said, I think you and I have already done several programs, and there really seems to be a hunger out there for people to get back on the road.
Mm-hmm. The tourism industry, it's been hard hit, and there's no doubt that there's a hunger for themed travel. And I think our timing with it being within our little Ohio universe was very good, because there's certain states you couldn't travel to. I have yet to visit a number of the places in the book because everything shut down. And I hope that some of the small museums that have been hurt by this will be able to reopen. But in the meantime, we've encouraged people to go and visit gardens around them and some of the other lovely opportunities you could do outside. And as they open up, even if it's limited, which a lot of them are, it's they're welcoming visitors again. But my situation was opposite of David Giffels, and that I was just getting going instead of shutting down. So a lot of online research and talking to people on the phone, but not in person, I'm afraid.
Well, I know, in fact, even as we are speaking here today, I just saw news that the Center for Science and Industry in Columbus is fully opening on June the 3rd. So, and again, for science fans who've had that gone for a long time, I mean, it's exciting. We're starting to see things opening back up. So and hopefully all of our literary trail sites before the end of this year are going to be back open, and we'll be excited. I'm excited the Ohioana Book Festival is still taking place, and I'm hopeful, and I know all of you as authors hope that the other events that you've grown used to, like the Buckeye Book Fair and Books by the Bank, etc., will be back up and functioning once again fully as we are. Lynn, what I wanted to ask you now is what particular thing have you learned about Ohio from writing this book, if you have?
Learned about Ohio from writing this book?
What have you learned about Ohio or anything in general, you know, by doing this specific book, you know, what's been the aha?
In my research, trying to find voices that were willing to get their stories into book format, I found that there were many, many people of diverse cultures to whom I had not yet connected. You know, I thought I knew a good bit living in Central Ohio, but I found families who had roots in Appalachia of Jewish heritage. And we started talking about Appalachia and the hills and the way you cooked and things like that. And that amazed me. I didn't know these people. Just asking questions, I found people of Native American culture, but not Shawnee and Cherokee predominantly, which you hear about in our area. They were of groups that I didn't know, and they had somehow managed to get into Central Ohio. So I found out that there was even greater diversity in the state of Ohio than I had even imagined, and that I still had a lot to learn.
Wonderful, wonderful. And, you know, I know oral history is an important thing. Someone suggested to me once that perhaps one thing Ohioans should consider doing is doing an oral history of a lot of our authors while they're writing, etc., things of that nature. So, and to catalog those, I was involved for many years with the theater program at the Leo Yazanoff Jewish Community Center here in Columbus. And they are so wonderful about documenting the history of the families who have come over and the stories they've told. And it's been wonderful because many of those early patriarchs, you know, are now gone, but their stories are preserved. So it's an important thing to, and again, not something we have done, but as an interesting thing that somebody has suggested to us, because well, Ohioana, since you are the kind of like the cheerleader and the caretaker of Ohio literature, maybe this would be a good project for you to take on. So after the Ohio Literary Trail.
Yeah, something to talk about, definitely.
Yeah. David, now I'm sure you learned a lot. I did want to ask a specific question of you two. I'm sure all of us were just flabbergasted with what we saw on the steps of the U.S. Capitol on January the 6th. And I was, one of the things that stunned me was how many Ohioans were there. The young woman from incredibly the town of Woodstock, Ohio. Woodstock conjures up a totally different image for all the three of us and everything, but from Woodstock, Ohio, who was one of the ringleaders and things of that nature. So, and I wanted to ask, you know, in the aftermath of what's happened since your book was published in something like January the 6th, did you talk to anybody, perhaps in your trails, that you thought, you know, that was that extreme in their views?
No, no. And, you know, one of the things that this book, I guess, proved that's become even more useful for, at least for me to understand, is that in great part because of social media, but also just because of the way that mainstream media is changing too, that we are more and more hearing the extreme voices much louder than the voices of most of what I would say is most of us. And so, you know, and so when one person from Ohio, you know, gets identified as an Ohioan in association with an event like that, it's easy for that extreme and that simple, social media logic to say, well, that's what Ohio is, in the same way that people in Minnesota right now, as the beginning of the Derek Chauvin trial begins, have to counteract the narrative that that's what life in Minnesota is. And so, one of the takeaways that I came away with is that really the silent majority is the middle, is people who are moderate, or who are not on the farthest extremes of that spectrum, which is a small percentage. And so I think Michigan is dealing with some of the same fallout, because there were some of the ringleaders were identified as coming from Michigan, and it's easy then to say, well, it's all those crazy right wingers who live up there in the great wilds of Michigan, but when in fact you go just travel any place and talk to a lot of people, and you find that people are reasonable. So I don't think we should deny that or hide from it, but I think we should expose it in a broader picture so that we understand its context.
So I guess your takeout, from your book and what you learned about Ohio is that really the extremes are just that. They're the extremes. Most people are really in the middle. They're the folks that go to work, take care of their houses, their kids, their gardens, and everything of that nature, and live relatively normal lives and are coping the best they can in a crisis like COVID-19, but they're not going off the deep end.
Yeah. And in fact, even when you talk about extremes, during 2019, when I was doing the research, the New York Times published the results of a study that two social scientists did, where they brought together, I forget the number, but it was a couple of hundred people to a retreat for a weekend, and they scientifically identified them so that they covered the entire spectrum of political thought, from the farthest left to the farthest right. And then they put them together in groups to talk for this weekend. And they gave them topics that, the economy, immigration, the topics that would be the current events topics. And their takeaway was, at the end of this weekend, nobody really left with their mind being changed about everything, but everybody left with a sense that they understood people who think differently from them better. And I think that's a really hopeful finding, because it's one thing to say, well, as long as people are moderate like I am, then we can all get along. I think it's much more hopeful to say even two people who are very far apart ideologically can still sit down and talk and find themselves, find their shared humanity.
Excellent, thank you. And of course, Betty, I thank you for giving me this question, but I mean, you certainly must have learned a lot about Ohio, but so much about Ohio. What is one thing you'd pick out?
David, this was not an area I knew a lot about when I started. And that's always the fun of research, is you don't go in thinking you know it, and you discover it. And that was the joy for me. I think the diversity of the state, when I think of states with great literary history, you think of Massachusetts and other locations, but the depth of the talent in our state and the diversity, whether it's, the playwrights, the poets, I was in Key West at Ernest Hemingway House, and I looked at a picture on the wall, and it was a bio of Sherwood Anderson from Ohio, and told the story of how he had influenced Hemingway and generations after him. And same thing with Mildred Wirt Benson and her Nancy Drew writing. And they talk about generations of Supreme Court justices who went on to be really impacted by Nancy Drew, this teenage sleuth at her, at a time when that wasn't Supreme Court justices, leaders, women leaders. So I think as a state, the incredible diversity and depth of what we have in every area, from the influencing Underground Railroad and women's rights, I found it all when I was digging into this, and it was an honor.
Well, it's fantastic. And as you were saying, about the depth of our talent, well, I'm going to tell this story. Courtney, who's recording us, has heard this before, so bear with me, Courtney. But if you just got, I was at an event and somebody asked Ohioana, they saw my name tag, what's that? And I told them, well, it's a library dedicated to Ohio authors and books. And they said, just about Ohio? Isn't that sort of parochial? And I said, you mean like cheering for the Buckeyes? I said, if a state can be proud of its football, baseball, and basketball players, why can't it be proud of its poets, its novelists, its essayists, its storytellers? So I mean, when you think of again, as evidenced by the literary trail, as evidenced by the three of you and all of the people who were coming to the Ohioana Book Festival and to other events at the state, Ohio is really has so much to be proud of when it comes to, we are one of the truly great literary centers in the United States, and celebrating it is what this event and what this library is all about. So I thank you all for being part of it. And Lynn, I'm going to ask you, each one last time, Lynn, hold up your book and say, what is one thing you want people to take away from your book, Supporting Diversity and Inclusion with Story?
An open mind, David. I'd like for people to look at the stories, to recognize the fact that people are people and that we all have a similar heart to our stories, and to use the discussions in them and the folktales themselves as a starting point for conversation and hopefully more research on the stories.
Thank you. David Giffels, Barnstorming Ohio to Understand America. What would you like people to take away? Kind of the thing was, even though the election is over, there's so much people can still get out of the book.
There it is. I would say that Ohio is still, and I think always has been and always will be, a place where you really can understand America. It remains kind of a cultural crossroads that is always worth telling. That, and that Jim Trafficant is probably the most fun politician to read about ever to set foot in Washington, D.C.
I remember Jim Trafficant well. Betty Weibel, the Ohio Literary Trail, a guide. Tell us what it's all, what do you want people to do besides get on the road?
So that's exactly it. I think as you create your post-pandemic bucket list for travel, I would remind you, you don't have to go far to be astounded and amazed. And you have great areas to discover in our own backyard. And don't forget about Ohio and be proud.
Wonderful. Well, thank all three of you again. Lynn Ford, Supporting Diversity and Inclusion with Story. David Giffels, Barnstorming Ohio to Understand America. And Betty Weibel, the Ohio Literary Trail, a guide. All of those books available through our official bookseller, The Book Loft of German Village at bookloft.com. Thanks again to all of our festival sponsors and partners. Thank all of you for joining us. Thank you for helping us spread the good word about Ohio literature and supporting these wonderful authors that we are proud to call Ohioans. And a final thank you to the Licking County Library, to Sherry and to Kent. And if you have something you would like to chime in and say here, thank you for hosting us today.
No, it's been great. Thanks for letting us be a part of this. This was a great panel. Thanks to Lynn, to David, and to Betty for participating.
Thank you. Check out everything else on the festival on our website, www.ohioana.org, and we'll see you soon.